You could be impeached any day of the week for what you've done, committing American troops, firing on innocent people. Saddam Hussein never had the power to do us any harm at all and had no intention of doing it. Now we're going to hang him. Oh boy, you see, that was a real serious war. We got him, and we've got to hang him. We have turned into the worst barbarians on earth, and that is how we are regarded in other countries. And I no longer put up a defense of us. I always used to say, Americans are not bad, they're certainly not stupid, but they're ignorant. The educational system is terrible, and the media is bought. That should just about take care of everybody.
I don't want to take up too much of your time here, but we did talk a little bit about criticism that you've endured. And at the end of this, chapter 51, it's a lot of chapters.
They're very short.
Yeah. You have this, you're discussing this fellow Altman who wrote about you and so forth, and I don't want to read the whole thing, but you talk about how he gets it wrong.
I'll say.
And he gets it wrong about, you mentioned Jews, and he has some quote where you mention a black writer and Jewish writer and so forth, which seems quite, and then he says you're not sympathetic to African-American writers. And
Which is just so stupid.
I just want to throw the third one in. And you didn't do enough for AIDS. And then you have this great response where you say, I'm not...
No, my virological skills are few.
But, I mean, people have really expected you... It's sort of weird, you know, you get damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If you come out with strong statements, then, you know, why is Gore Vidal again saying something? But on the other hand, people have criticized you for not championing every cause around, right? I mean, that's what I got in this.
I quote Altman because he's very sympathetic. Much of what he's written in this book about me is pretty intelligent. He's Australian, though, and he doesn't really know the American context to everything. And I got word to him, and I said, you know, I was just invited by the Congressional Black Caucus to address them. I'd just flown in from Italy. I said, do you think that would happen to this writer, that writer, the other writer?
But you, in fact, were a strong supporter of writers like Baldwin.
I certainly was. I tried for 2 years to get Go Tell It on the Mountain published, which was the original title, was Cry Holy. I remember it was in 2 white cardboard boxes. And I gave it to Elliot McCrae, who owned E.P. Dutton. And he looked at it for a while and said, that James Boyd? I said, yeah. He said, I can't publish it. I said, why not? It's a wonderful book. He said, I'm from Virginia. Now, this is, you know, this is not 1920. This is 1946 or 7.
Yeah, you actually made the point that they had to go to France to establish it.
To be established and properly praised.
Well, what change have you, I mean, there's 2 areas there. You got, Baldwin was a homosexual and a black man. And how much has the world changed for those 2 categories, or people in those 2 categories?
Not much.
Really?
No. It's more vocal nowadays, and you know, there are people who wrap themselves in the pink triangle. People wrap themselves in Africa. But the feelings are still there. Note the campaign which we're now enduring. Mr. Foley for the Republicans is in great trouble and is harming them, I gather, just by what he is, not his little notes to page boards or whatever they are in the Senate.
So you really don't think it's changed that much?
Very little. Very, very little. That you have militant movements sometimes set in motion by one minority or another minority. Doesn't mean it's changed people's views. They're fed them from birth. They don't change. I was just down in Texas, you know, speaking in Austin, which is the liberal capital of the state. I was just talking to liberal-minded Texans about their problems. The same old problems.
Really? So you don't even think there's more tolerance? I mean, here we are in Hollywood and so forth. I mean, out of the closet, all of the stuff that we've been hearing, gay marriages. In the case of black people, they're now called black instead of Negro. There's
Changing a word does not alter a situation.
Let me ask you, you used the word conspiracy before, and one interesting part of the book is your view of the Kennedy assassination. And my hat's off to you on this, I mean, because it's one that, it's like Israel, the third rail, you don't want to touch it.
No.
You make a really persuasive case.
Well, I recommend you read the book that I'm quoting from,
Yeah.
which took 14 years. These two guys wrote it, and they got a lot of interviews with people like Cyrus Vance, I think. A lot of Freedom of Information Act. The CIA was coughing up stuff. It's the most thorough account we'll ever have of it.
But it's interesting because I guess your stepfather was
Jackie's stepfather, too.
yeah, and you knew Kennedy,
Yeah.
and I guess you knew Bobby somewhat. No?
Yes, I know.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have these different views. We have this mythical view of, well, even my students at USC, well, that must have been a good time, But as you point out in the book, the fact is they traffic with gangsters. You say in the book, they probably got killed as a result of that. The same very people that they were sending to kill Castro.
Catastrophic irony, I call it.
What do you make of all that? Was it that we let the Shanty Irish get in our politics? Was this a disorderly family?
Well, it's, if there was a villain at all, it would be old Joe Kennedy, who was quite an operator and often dealt with the forces of darkness. And right toward the end of his life, Frank Costello used to come over in Central Park South to have dinner. And I remember Ray Stark, the producer out here, it was an old Teamster, and who used to go over and gave great massages. So Kennedy and Costello would be, before they had dinner, they'd get massages from this old guy. And then they would just gossip, and the old guy kept his ears open. And Ray Stark knew him, and Ray told me about this. And I checked again, and it says, indeed, there was a former Teamster who used to come by Central Park South. And Costello was assigned to Joe Kennedy when he married into the Fitzgerald family up in Boston. And the first thing the Fitzgeralds provided him with was a bank. Presumably that was a laundromat. And then the mob sent him a young Italian called Costello. They remained friends to the end. What went wrong was that Bobby, wanting to build up his image after he was known as a cop, ruthless cop, who had gone after Hoffa, not a nice man, of course, but gone after him. Then he did the big arrests up in Appalachia of a lot of mob leaders.
Very dramatic in the newspaper.
Oh, yeah.
Surrounding the retreat.
Well, he thought that was going to make him president next time around, after Jack. But it backfired. So there was a conversation between Trafficante, who was out of Chicago, and he was in charge of the mob in Tampa, Florida, and Marcello, who was the head of the mob in New Orleans, which also included the Havana, which by then was a hot subject. Casinos. Bobby hated Marcello and just dropped him off in Guatemala in the forest. It's in the book, it's quite fascinating. Marcello swore vengeance. Trafficante is talking to him, the conversation is being recorded. And Trafficante says, we got to get rid of Bobby. I mean, this is awful, he's going to go after more and more and more of us, and so on. And Marcello says, if a dog is bothering you, you don't cut off its tail. And that was the death sentence for poor Jack. Then the Kennedy brothers were arranging, this is after the missile crisis and the general promise to Khrushchev to lay off the Cubans. And Jack said, well, we will if he will allow us to inspect the missiles.
Yeah, everyone, I'm sorry to interrupt, but everyone forgets that everybody thinks Kennedy won that day. The fact is he caved because he gave Khrushchev a promise not to overthrow Castro, and after the failed Bay of Pigs, he had given the emigres or the exiles in Florida the promise that he would invade again.
Yeah.
And they were gearing up for another invasion, but because of the missile crisis, they called it, at least temporarily, called it off.
Yes, they did. Ultimate Sacrifice is a book that's just out, and I highly recommend it. It describes how the Kennedy brothers were planning in 1963, December, to overthrow Castro on the grounds that he had not lived up to the agreement with Khrushchev, which was that Kennedy would not invade Cuba if we were allowed to check and see whether the missiles that were there were really there and so on. Castro didn't live up to that. Kennedy took this, okay. The brothers decided, now we'll get Castro. What we didn't do at the Bay of Pigs, we'll do now. But it has to be done in total secrecy because it can be a cause of war if Khrushchev finds out. Because the Russians have proven that they can do us a lot of damage. And they've got a base against the United States and Cuba. So in the greatest of secrecy, the CIA was left out of it because Jack always thought that they were the ones who had made the mess at the Bay of Pigs. So it was put under the Department of Defense, so it was pretty much an army maneuver. Now the Kennedy, they called it C-Day, which either C for Castro or C for Cuba. Then it was penetrated. Now by then the mafia, as I was explaining earlier, was very angry at Bobby Kennedy. And then they transferred their anger to his boss, the president. And 3 mafia godfathers decided to kill Jack. That was Carlos Marcello of New Orleans, and sometimes Havana, Santo Trafficante of Tampa, Florida, and Johnny Roselli out of Chicago. And all 3 were being vigorously pursued by Attorney General Robert Kennedy, along with a dozen of their associates, of whom 6 were also working on the Castro murder case. Now, there were 3 attempts made on Jack's life. The mob bosses, these are Trafficantians, so Marcello was in charge of this, basically, targeted JFK twice before Dallas, once in Chicago on November 2nd, 1963. JFK called off his motorcade. Then in Tampa on November 18, he went through the parade, this motorcade that went on endlessly, and he knew that there was somebody out there with a gun. Exactly the same setup that they used at Dallas, which was his next stop. And the next stop, he was killed. So for a long time, everybody wondered in Washington, those of us who knew the Kennedys, Bobby, who was nothing if not vengeful, he was still Attorney General of the United States. LBJ had kept him in office. So the FBI is under him. He could have conducted a great investigation. Why didn't he? Who killed his brother? All this nonsense about Lee Harvey Oswald. It was pretty hollow even then. And he was afraid. First, the cover-up comes from Johnson. They don't want any trouble from the Russians, and they felt there might be trouble. So Bobby conducted really basically no investigation, and nobody else did either. Then he said to Bill Walton, a friend of mine, friend of all of us in those days, and to a number of other people, and Bobby would find this toward the end of his career in Washington. He said he knew who was behind it. It was Marcello of New Orleans, mafia guy. But he couldn't say a word about it because the plot to kill Castro would be revealed to the whole world. The Kennedys would be under a very dark cloud, even though there are people still mourning for poor Jack.